The torches crackle in the cold night air. Smoke drifts upward, thick and heavy, swallowing the stars above your kingdom. You stand on the balcony of your palace, looking down at the courtyard below. Thousands of people fill the square, but no one speaks. The silence is worse than shouting. You hear chains dragging across stone. You hear boots shifting. You hear a man struggling to breathe. At the center of the courtyard, a rebel kneels. His face is bruised, his wrists are bound. Blood runs down his cheek, but he does not beg. He looks up at you, and he does not look afraid. Hours ago, fires burned at the edges of your city. Banners of rebellion were raised against your rule. Your generals whisper that more traitors hide in the shadows. This man knows their names. He knows their plans. He knows who is waiting to strike again. But he refuses to speak. Your advisors lean closer. Make an example of him, they tell you. Break him publicly. Let the kingdom see what happens to those who defy you. Because fear spreads faster than rebellion. Because one broken body might stop 1,000 more from rising. The executioner waits below, hooded and still. Iron tools lie beside him, glinting in the firelight. If you give the order, the crowd will witness it all. The screams, the cracking of bone, the slow, unforgettable lesson. And maybe, just maybe, the rebellion will die with him. But if you refuse, the uprising grows. Civil war tears through your land. Families starve, cities burn, thousands die. The crown on your head suddenly feels heavier than iron. One life, or thousands. You lift your hand. Tell me, is it more brutal to torture one, or to allow thousands to die? And this is how history begins to justify its darkest punishments. If you believe history's darkest punishments should be remembered, not erased, subscribe. And if you don't, tell me in the comments why these stories should stay buried. The order is given. Not with a shout. Not with fury. Just a slow lowering of your hand. And history begins its work. Because power does not only punish. It performs. What you are about to witness is not chaos. It is calculation. And across centuries, rulers refined it. To variation 1, public flogging. Punishment meant to humiliate, not to kill. The rebel is stripped, not to cause death, but to remove dignity. In the ancient legions of the Roman Empire, soldiers who broke discipline were scourged before crucifixion. The lashes were not random, they were ritual. Leather thongs embedded with bone and metal tore skin slowly. Each strike counted. Each strike witnessed. The body bends. The crowd watches. Blood becomes instruction. Because humiliation travels faster than execution. A corpse inspires martyrdom. A broken man inspires fear. The condemned is left alive, trembling, exposed, reduced. His identity no longer belongs to him. It belongs to the state. The psychology is precise. Death ends pain. Humiliation extends it. You destroy not just flesh, but reputation. You make the punishment visible long after the wounds close. And the crowd learns something far more powerful than fear. They learn shame. Is humiliation worse than death? When a man must live with the memory of kneeling, is that mercy? Or refinement of cruelty? 3 Variation 2, mutilation as deterrence. Now the blade changes purpose. Not to end life, but to edit it. Hands severed for theft. Tongues removed for dissent. Foreheads branded so no marketplace forgets. Permanent reminders. In the courts of the Byzantine Empire, rivals to the throne were blinded, not killed. Because an emperor must appear whole. And a blind man cannot rule. It was considered merciful. blood spilled without execution, power secured without martyrdom. But blindness is a living darkness. In the palaces of the Ottoman Empire, executions were precise, controlled, deliberate. Some were strangled with silk cords to avoid spilling royal blood. Others were displayed publicly, bodies arranged as warnings. Visibility mattered. Punishment had to be seen, or it did not exist. A missing hand speaks louder than a grave, because the mutilated walk among the living. They are warnings with heartbeats. So you must ask yourself, is permanent mutilation more merciful than execution? To die once, or to wake every day inside a body marked by power? Which is kinder? And why does history so often call it justice? For Variation 3, Death as Spectacle. Now the transformation is complete. Punishment becomes theater. Crowds gather not out of fear, but anticipation. In the arenas of the Roman Empire, condemned prisoners were executed between gladiator matches, animals released, fires staged, mythological scenes reenacted with real suffering. The grandest stage stood in the heart of Rome, the Colosseum, an architectural masterpiece, designed not only for combat, but for visibility. Tens of thousands filled its seats. They ate. They cheered. They demanded more. Death became choreography. The condemned were costumed as villains from legend, as enemies of the state, as symbols of chaos. And when they died, the audience applauded. Because spectacle does something subtle. It removes intimacy. Suffering at a distance becomes entertainment. Pain framed as narrative becomes acceptable. The state no longer says, "We punish." It says, "We protect you from this." And the crowd agrees. They return home feeling safer, not realizing they have just participated in violence. So here is the fracture in our morality. Why do people condemn torture, yet historically gathered to watch it? Why do societies reject cruelty in theory, but consume it when staged? Is it justice we seek, or reassurance that we are not the ones kneeling? And now return to the balcony. Return to your hand still suspended in air. You believed this was about one rebel. It never was. It was about memory, about control, about shaping how your kingdom understands fear. Because once punishment becomes public, it becomes narrative, and narratives outlive rulers. History does not simply record brutality. It rationalizes it. It labels it necessary, strategic, stabilizing. It calls it peacekeeping. And somewhere in the crowd, a child watches, learning. If power humiliates, he will remember humiliation. If power mutilates, he will remember the blade. If power performs death, he will learn to applaud. This is how cycles begin. This is how civilizations teach themselves what cruelty looks like. And this is how they convince themselves it is justified. If you're still watching, ask yourself, would you have looked away in the arena? Or would you have stayed seated? Backhand index pointing down. In the next act, we descend deeper into punishments designed not for speed, but for endurance, where suffering was stretched across hours, sometimes days. Subscribe if you're ready to confront what history rarely softens. Because the darkest punishments were not accidents. They were inventions. Here you watch, and you recoil. Because what unfolds is abhorrent. And yet, most viewers claim they oppose torture. Most viewers declare they reject cruelty. But history has always known a different truth. Humans oppose brutality in theory, yet demand it emotionally. They cheer when justice feels swift. They approve when punishment seems deserved. They rationalize pain as long as it is labeled necessary. Do we oppose brutality in theory, but crave it when it touches our sense of right and wrong? Consider the disconnect. A man kneeling, leather straps tearing his skin. A blade pausing just long enough to let terror sink in. We gasp. We look away. Yet our hearts surge, demanding order. We want the crime punished. We demand satisfaction. It is a contradiction centuries old, and one your own mind has already confronted. Because morality is elastic. Because fear is persuasive. Because the narrative of justice seduces even the conscientious. So ask yourself, do you oppose cruelty? Or do you oppose being reminded of your own vulnerability? 6. Push the moral edge further. Now the line blurs. Punishment becomes experimentation. Suffering becomes a theater of endurance. Consider impalement. A slow, deliberate intrusion. Bodies pinned upright, writhing suspended. A public display of patience, fear, and inevitability. Crushing devices. Spikes, wedges, racks, presses. Bones bending under calculated pressure. The body instructing the mind on the limits of human endurance. Fire, not merely to kill, but to illuminate. Flames licking flesh while crowds observe. Pain transmuted into spectacle. Screams echoing like music. And then Ling Chai. The death by 1,000 cuts. A meticulous choreography of agony. Every strike intentional. Every movement measured. Every second extended. Vlad the Impaler, centuries ago, perfected terror as tool. Limbs mounted along city walls. Fear made concrete. Every observer learning submission. Ask yourself this. Is cruelty worse when it is slow? When the mind has time to comprehend the inevitability of suffering? When hope is stretched thin, and every second amplifies terror? The answer is not simple. Because endurance punishment is not merely physical. It is psychological. It is memory encoded in pain. It is terror written in the body and transmitted to every observer. Notice how your reaction changes, how horror becomes fascination, how morality begins to fracture under observation. This is the dark architecture of power. It does not just punish. It teaches. It programs. It ensures that fear is remembered longer than any law. And now, look closer, because the methods grow darker, and the question grows sharper. Would you still look away? Or lean in? Subscribe and prepare. Because in the next act, we cross into punishments that were designed not just to harm, but to rewrite the mind of the condemned, where endurance meets obsession, and suffering becomes a slow, living lesson in absolute control. History never softens these lessons. It only records them. And now so do you. Consequence versus principle. Now we step back. We look beyond flesh, beyond screams. To understand why cruelty persists, we must examine the frameworks that justify it. One approach, consequence. Utilitarian reasoning. Punish one brutally to deter many. A single act of suffering becomes a lesson etched into the lives of thousands. Pain becomes arithmetic. Fear becomes policy. The individual sacrificed to safeguard the collective. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham codified this. Pleasure, pain, consequence. The calculus of cruelty. Efficiency in suffering. Justice measured not in right and wrong, but in the prevention of future disorder. And then there is principle. Categorical morality. Cruelty is wrong, regardless of outcome. Immanuel Kant insisted on the inviolability of human dignity. No end, no justification, could sanction suffering inflicted deliberately. Yet history rarely followed principle. Power seldom cared about philosophical elegance. It followed consequence. It followed fear. It followed control. So ask yourself, is punishment about justice or fear? Does it seek righting of wrongs or maintenance of order? Do we consent to cruelty because it feels righteous or because we fear becoming its next subject? Notice how uncomfortable that distinction feels, how easy it is to convince yourself of necessity, how quickly morality bends in the shadow of authority. 8. The psychology of spectacle. Now consider the stage. Why were punishments public? Why were they elaborate? Why were the methods ritualized, choreographed, repeated? Fear is social glue. It binds communities. It defines what is acceptable. It tells the powerful who belongs and who exists to be reminded. Ritualized cruelty is theater. It communicates. It teaches without words. A lash, a branded hand, a public execution, each a symbol, each a lesson in obedience. The state's monopoly on violence is absolute, not simply in force, but in visibility. The crowd sees. The crowd internalizes. The crowd participates. Every scream echoes in the mind of the citizen. Every spectacle whispers, "You could be next." And the punishment is not complete until it is observed, until the lesson takes root, until fear is encoded socially. Even the most ritualized cruelty carries subtle instruction. It establishes hierarchy. It teaches reverence. It marks boundaries. And you, the observer, are complicit. Even as you recoil, even as you hide your eyes, your mind is cataloging. Your memory is recording. Your understanding of power is shaped. Notice how the spectacle transforms morality, how it blurs the line between justice and terror, how suffering becomes narrative, because the state does not merely punish. It educates. It manipulates. It molds the collective conscience. And now pause. Look back at all you have witnessed. Do you feel disgust or understanding? Do you condemn cruelty or admire the precision with which it commands obedience? Subscribe if you are ready, because the next act descends into the most harrowing explorations of endurance, where punishment is no longer about deterrence, but about obsession, where suffering becomes a prolonged experiment in the limits of flesh, mind, and society. History is waiting, and so are the lessons it refuses to soften. The breaking wheel. Now we enter the world of deliberate endurance, a punishment designed not to end life swiftly, but to rewrite the body into a symbol. The victim is tied to a massive wheel, limbs spread and secured. An iron bar or mallet shatters bones, each strike measured, each fracture a message. The body becomes part of the machine, arms and legs woven through the spokes. Every movement causes agony. Every shift prolongs pain. Sometimes victims are left alive for hours, sometimes for days. Exposure to sun, cold, wind, thirst and hunger. Every sensory deprivation amplifying torment. Across medieval Europe, the wheel was both punishment and spectacle. It served multiple purposes. Political, a visible assertion of the ruler's authority. Deterrent, a warning carved into memory. Religious, a cautionary tale of sin and divine wrath. Social, an event for the community, binding observers in shared fear. Notice how the cruelty becomes systemic. Not accidental, not chaotic, but deliberate. A ritualized theater where the body teaches obedience, and you, the viewer, cannot remain passive. Your mind catalogs the lesson. You understand the power of visibility. Scaphism. Now consider a punishment so calculated, it seems designed to torment both flesh and psyche. The victim is trapped between two boats, bound tightly, sun-baked, forced to ingest copious amounts of milk and honey. The sweet substance coats the skin. The sweet substance feeds insects. Flies, ants, worms, beetles, drawn to the body. They eat, they crawl, they sting. The victim's flesh becomes a living feast. Pain is constant. Death arrives slowly, over days. Attributed to the Achaemenid Empire, this method demonstrates an ancient understanding. Slow, public suffering engraves obedience deeper than swift execution. It becomes a lesson in endurance, a lesson in horror, a lesson in power. And as always, the state is not content with secrecy. Observers witness the torment. They internalize fear. They are trained in caution, compliance, and hierarchy. Ask yourself, would you look away? Or watch, unable to resist understanding the mechanics of power? Drawing and quartering. Finally, England. Treason. A punishment designed to annihilate dignity, identity, and corporeal integrity. The condemned is hanged until near death. The body disemboweled while still alive. Beheading follows. Then the corpse is divided. Limbs displayed across the kingdom. Here, punishment is multidimensional. Political, to warn anyone who would betray the crown. Deterrence, to make rebellion unthinkable. Religious, the body's destruction framed as a moral and spiritual correction. Public participation, citizens witness, remember, and internalize fear. Every element is symbolic. Every strike, every display, a lesson encoded in terror. Power is absolute not merely in enforcement, but in narrative. The state dictates what suffering teaches. Factual depth layer. Consider these punishments together. Understand why they exist. Political motivations. Leaders projected authority, controlled dissent, and prevented uprisings. Deterrence theory, pain as a warning, endurance as instruction, suffering as memory. Religious symbolism, execution as moral lesson, body as canvas for divine order. Public participation, fear transmitted socially, internalized, and perpetuated. And now reflect. Every act you have witnessed is not chaos. It is deliberate, calculated, performed with awareness of the human mind, of social structures, of memory. Even centuries later, the lessons persist. Through stories, histories, and the shadow of our imagination. Subscribe, watch closely. Because the next act confronts punishment at the intersection of endurance, obsession, and the human psyche, where suffering becomes a study of the mind as much as the body, where cruelty is not only felt but remembered and taught. And now, after centuries of observation, after the slow unraveling of flesh, mind, and society, we arrive at the fracture. Were these punishments evil or effective? Did cruelty stabilize societies? Did ritualized suffering maintain order? Did fear bind kingdoms, empires, and civilizations together in ways that peace could not? Would modern states exist without historical cruelty? Would law, governance, and societal hierarchy have endured without centuries of public terror, mutilation, and spectacle? These are questions with no comfortable answers. The tension remains unresolved. Your mind cannot settle. Your morality wavers. Because history does not provide absolutes. It provides evidence. You are forced to confront what you wish were unknowable. That human societies are shaped as much by brutality as by compassion. That power teaches obedience in the language of pain. That fear, spectacle, and endurance are as much tools of governance as law itself. And as you reflect, notice your own reaction. Disgust, fascination, shame, understanding. All are valid. All are expected. Because morality fractures when faced with the deliberate architecture of cruelty. If history's darkest truths disturb you, that's the point. Subscribe to the darkest punishments in history. Because silence protects cruelty. If you won't subscribe, explain in the comments why these stories should stay buried. Because knowledge is dangerous. Because awareness is uncomfortable. Because remembering prevents repetition. And now, history leaves you with one final question. Will you watch or look away? Because in darkness, everything is recorded, everything is remembered, and nothing ever truly disappears.